Hello, good morning, and thank you for joining this morning's Dods webinar on this year's party conferences, what we learned and what comes next. And that will be the sort of theme as we go through. This is actually our second in our Insights webinar series brought to you by Dods Research. And our current Dods subscribers, you can reach out to your account managers and find out more about our research projects. And for those of you who are joining us and aren't currently Dods subscribers, please reach out to our customer service team who will fill you in on our current Dods research projects and talk to you about how we can also fulfill your needs for research. As I said, this is our second in our series of these webinars, and we want to ensure we bring you the insights that you need as a team and helpful for your roles. So if there's anything that you would like to see in future sessions and would like us to cover in future webinars, that could be anything from how an APPG works, how it gets set up, or how to engage with private members' bills, and the process of passing legislation. So if that's something that you'd like to see, or if you have any ideas, please drop them in the comments or Q&A box below. For this week's and today's webinar, I am delighted to be able to say that I'm joined by Jill Rutter, who is a senior fellow at the Institute for Government, and Jill is an experienced former civil servant where she worked in the Treasury, Number 10 and DEFRA. Jill is also a regular commentator on the media for a wide range of issues from the civil service all the way through to Brexit, and is a senior research fellow at the UK and a Changing Europe. We're actually obviously very excited to have Jill with us today and to take a look back at what happened at this year's party conferences and what we can learn from them. So Jill, before I ask you to get us underway, I will just let everyone know that the Q&A box can also be used to pop in your own questions, and I'll pose those to Jill as we get to the final part of today's session. So please, any point you want to have a question, please pop those into the Q&A box, and I'll pose those to Jill. So Jill, you've observed and analysed party conferences for some years now, and this year you were at Lib Dems in Bournemouth, Labour in Liverpool, and the Conservatives in Manchester. And before we do a deep dive into each of those conferences, I'd like you maybe to explain how you would capture the mood for each of those party conferences this year.
Thanks a lot, Dean, and absolutely delighted to do so. And just by way of added context, the Institute for Government actually did our first ever fringe event at Reform this year. And our director, Hannah White, also went to the Green Party conference. So we did an unprecedented 5 party conferences. But as you said, I did the mainstream legacy 3 of Labour, Lib Dems and the Conservatives. And you said that I was a long-term civil servant, which I was. So I think my view of party conferences, I really love party conferences. And I think that's all those years of denial, because of course UK civil servants aren't allowed to go to party conferences if you're in the politically restricted grade. So I've only been going to party conferences since I was at the Institute for Government. So I think they're absolutely fascinating. So just a bit on the mood then of the 3 I went to, and I'll add a bit of Hannah's insights on the other 2. So the Lib Dems were very, very bouncy. They had it in Bournemouth. I arrived on Saturday in a howling gale, but by the Sunday, they were by the seaside. It was super sunny. The Lib Dems always seem to have good weather, and it was a very upbeat mood. But I think in contrast to Brighton the year before, when they were just coming off that very big election victory, there was a bit of frustration at the Lib Dem conference combined with the optimism. In last year, all you had to do at a Lib Dem fringe was say 72 MPs, and they basically bounced off the walls in happiness because they couldn't believe how well they'd done in the general election, that they'd finally managed to crack the electoral system and get a number of MPs proportional to the vote that they got. So they were very, very happy. And they actually had new MPs walking around with lanyards saying, "I'm a new MP." And people were handing out their email addresses like candy. You thought, they're going to regret this. They're going to regret this. But there was a very buoyant mood. So I think there was still quite a buoyant mood. But there was also frustration. And the frustration could be summarised as, we've got 72 MPs. Reform have 5. They dip between 5 and 4, depending on who's quit the party this week. And yet all the attention is on Reform. It's not on us. So why aren't we cutting through? And I think we saw that some of that frustration coming out in Ed Davies' conference speech. So it was, we're here. Why are we not making more of an impact? Is this the media ignoring us? Why are we not cutting through? So that was, I think, sort of bouncy frustration at the Lib Dems in sort of sun-drenched-y sort of way. Move on to Labour. The surprising thing about Labour last year was how unupbeat the Labour Party conference was, because you normally expect a Labour Party conference where you were coming off of such a big electoral victory, you're just back, you've got your mitts on power for the first time in 14 years. But I think while there were lots of good parties last year, the more general mood was a bit sort of rabbits in front of a headlights. My God, this governing thing is really, really quite hard. And it's just sort of, or whatever. And I think actually this time around, despite the travails of the government, I think you would say Labour was possibly a bit more comfortable in power this time round. The people who'd survived the reshuffle were there thinking, well, I've got my job, I'm going to be able to stay there. But I think the interesting thing that I was just talking to some colleagues upstairs was that there weren't really any new policies unveiled at the Labour Party conference. Normally, one of the nightmares, any civil servant listening will know, one of the nightmares as a civil servant in the party conference is that ministers will be looking around for things they can unveil at the party conference. And quite often those are policies that have not been worked on, launched into the world slightly prematurely. But Labour was a very sort of policy poor conference. And clearly the sort of side story was all the Andy Burnham presence. Andy Burnham was there doing sort of events. He was actually quite present at the Conservative Party conference as well, which is in his manner of Manchester, if you like. But that clearly sort of fizzled like a bit of firework that went off and then turned into a bit of a damp squib. So it was quite interesting, but one of the things that both we and quite a lot of the other think tanks holding fringes noted was it was super hard to get ministers or even MPs to do your panels. It was complicated by the reshuffle. But even before that, there was a lot of hesitancy and caution about people coming out, and whether that was because of big fears about what people might say in the run up to the budget. I think it was really interesting that it was very difficult to get people to come and perform. Even people who've been soliciting invitations earlier in the year, you went round and said, oh, you asked to speak on something, how about this, would suddenly be sort of running for cover and hiding. So I think that was a really interesting theme. And of course, one of the things about not coming out to play at party conference is that reduces the incentive of people to put on events there, because you put on events there because it's an opportunity for people to hear from significant party members. And if they'll only do Labour Together events, then everybody else gets a bit turned off by that. So, or Tony Blair Institute, maybe. So move on to the Conservatives. The Conservatives last year were amazingly bouncy. Really, really, really amazingly bouncy. A bit of a sense of liberation that we've managed to, we're still here despite this great electoral defeat, and we don't have to take responsibility anymore. But the thing you noticed last year was just how energized the membership was by being part of the decision on the party leadership, which seems really quite a long time ago. So roll forward to this year, and the first thing to note was the composition of who was there was really interesting. So quite a lot of members, but relatively few other people. I mean, it was, you would rattle around the sort of conference place where normally you'd have loads and loads of corporates and, lobbyists and things like that putting up stalls, but the Conservatives seemed to have to erect some rooms in the conference centre to make it sort of feel a bit fuller. So it was quite empty, fewer fringes, a lot fewer fringes. And although it was very sort of policy rich and quite a lot of discussions going on, there's quite a narrow range of issues that people were really interested in. And the best-selling events seem to be the very introspective ones about the future of the right, because obviously the thing that was lurking over all these party conferences was the spectre of Reform, who did something earlier, kicked off the conference season with something that looked much more like a conventional party conference than previous Reform rallies, but still sort of big stage, Farage as the centerpiece. And then just after all of these, we had the sort of bookending populists with Zach Polanski making his debut in quite a sort of barnstorming eco-populist event at the Green parties. What was notable was Reform for the first time really did do some fringes. IFG, as I said, did a fringe about how Reform could perform in local government with the leader of Kent and somebody who's on their NHS, on the Reform Policy Board, Gawain Towler. So we did that. We didn't do anything at the Greens, and they didn't really do conventional policy fringes. There was much more sessions for their councillors or candidates about campaigning, which is quite a big theme always at Lib Dem conferences as well, because that's one of the things clearly the Lib Dems get right. So that's my very brief tour d'horizon of the party conference. Of course, there are also Welsh nationalists, and we've just had the SNP conference up in Aberdeen. But I haven't this year been to either of those.
Thank you, Jill. I know you stated there that you're on several panels across the conferences. Would you say that there were many, or can you point to any inconsistencies between what the key figures of each party were saying on the main stage and what maybe was coming out from those fringe events?
So the fringe events did. That's interesting. I mean, if you look at where the sort of action is on the fringe, I mean, it's partly reflects who will sponsor what. So at a couple of both party conferences, I did fringes for Nesta on what were the sort of tax options for the budget, and I think it's quite interesting. It's quite interesting. We were doing a fringe event at the Labour Party conference, two newly elected MPs, very economically literate MPs, and we were talking about the need. Tim Loynig from Nesta and I were talking about the need for tax reform as well as tax raising, the sort of thing the IFS was saying yesterday in their prelude to the Green budget. Helen Miller was supposed to be on the panel and couldn't come, so I was subbing for Helen. And what was really interesting there was at one point the newly elected MPs looked and said, well, why is all this tax reform not happening? If there's a consensus around tax reform, why is it not happening? Is it the civil service getting in the way? We went, no, it's because ministers are terrified of the politics of winners and losers. This is not a civil service problem. This is a political problem, and you need to get onto the politics there. So I think there was more policy discussions at Labour on the fringe. It was quite interesting who the big attractions were on the fringe. Shabana Mahmood, clearly, the sort of newly elevated Home Secretary, was clearly a big attraction. I think one of the things that was interesting about the fringe was at all conferences was how little foreign policy there really was at any of them. The Conservatives, as always, were having lots and lots of agonizes about climate change policy. I think, I just did a vlog for UK and a Changing Europe yesterday about how Europe was treated, which was sort of a bit of a non-issue at all the conferences, which is such an amazing contrast to all those party conferences you went to after the Brexit vote, when it was the absolute obsession and dominating both on the floor and in the fringes. So not very much of that. Conservatives barely had an event on the NHS, really quite uninterested in public services, but quite a lot of where do we go? And this, I think you sort of picked up with Mel Stride and then Kemi Badenoch, quite a lot on, what's the emerging sort of, Conservative offer on the economy. But basically, most of the conference speeches, the big speeches, were a bit over obsessed with reform, I thought, which was maybe a bit of an obsession in those future of the right conversations, which were so sold out you couldn't really get in the room for them. But so I didn't manage to go to any of those. Because one of the things you have to do is sort of, compete to what you can get
Yeah.
into. And if things require you to be queuing up half an hour, whatever. I did go to quite an interesting session on migration, where I got there very early, and I went to that with the correspondent of the New York Times. So it's also quite interesting to spot which sessions journalists are going to, and which sessions people from foreign embassies are going to, because they all go en masse to find out the mood of the parties and report back on the British political scene.
And you mentioned there are a lot of the topics that were discussed or some that weren't. Do you think we can pull any sort of dividing lines between all the parties on some of those matters, whether it be economic management or immigration, public services, net zero? Are those clearer now after the conference, would you say?
Okay, maybe we'll take those in a bit of order.
Yeah.
I mean, public services, I would say, barely discussed. But one of the things we did think was very interesting in Mel Stride's offer of cuts, so that 47 billion figure he was waving around, was that he didn't propose to roll back any of Rachel Reeves's big increases in public service. And in a sense, in Labour, the real question is, how do we actually get any benefits from the money we've put into public services? So public services, not really discussed. I chaired a panel for the Health Foundation at the Lib Dem conference, where they were unveiling some Ipsos Mori research. And one of the things that was super interesting there, I thought, was that they had this poll. They'd asked people, who do you trust most on health on the NHS? And Labour polled at 22%. The Conservatives came next, and then 16, Reform on 15, I think, and then the Lib Dems on about 9. And I thought that was really interesting, and part of the sort of cut-through issue for the Lib Dems was care has been one of their big domestic policy issues that they've been trying to push, but a big sort of sense that they hadn't made any progress on that. So I thought that was very interesting. But I mean, there were no I didn't see very much sort of serious discussion of, say, what should we be doing on social care, or how do we reform the NHS at the big party conferences I went to. So public services, a bit missing in action. Net zero, quite interesting. I chaired a panel at Labour where quite gung-ho on progress with Michael Shanks, who's the DESNZ minister, quite gung-ho on the progress that they were making. And there was a very interesting moment when Michael Shanks said, we're the department that really gets how to make missions work. Sorry, Wes, as in the sort of health missions a bit sort of stuck. And I think that's absolutely an assessment that the Institute for Government would agree with, that actually the place that it really is making sort of progress, different question about whether it's enough progress, is DESNZ, and that health really looks a bit sort of stuck. So I think that's quite an interesting point, but big concerns even at that about how to deliver Labour's promise on lower energy prices. And even from our panelists from the IPPR on that one, a bit of concern that the 2030 decarb target may lead Labour to lock into over high prices through contracts of difference over the coming sort of decade. But a clear differentiation now with the Conservatives. So I chaired a Chatham Housey, I think it's probably Chatham Housey round table on Conservative energy policy, which was really quite sort of well attended, but it was mainly well attended by Conservative supporters of net zero. But I think really quite interesting there, quite a lot of concern among those quarters about Kemi Badenoch's denunciation, if you like, of the Climate Change Act. A big sense that actually you might need to amend and update the Climate Change Act, but you probably didn't want to ditch the Climate Change Act. Quite a lot of concern about Ofgem. But again, the big spectre that looms in energy, and this is common across those party conferences, the big spectre that looms is energy prices and the consequences of the UK's very, very high industrial energy prices. So quite interesting, industrial electricity prices. So quite an interesting dynamic there, but quite a lot of concerns about, where the Conservatives really going. Quite a lot of enthusiasm there for nuclear, but is that a really quick solution? And you saw Claire Coutinho making a lot of this on her conference speech about her new energy policy that she was unveiling. Because in contrast to Labour, this was a very policy-rich Conservative Party conference. On Europe, which used to dominate and where I did a bit of compare and contrast, what was very noticeable is not really a mention at Reform or the Greens. I don't think either Nigel Farage or Zach Polanski mentioned Europe Brexit. Keir Starmer slightly coming out and saying maybe Brexit wasn't a howling success. He, managed to put the words Brexit and snake oil merchants quite close together in his conference speech, but absolutely did not major on what was possible in the reset. And I chaired an event on this for UK and a Changing Europe with Hilary Benn, and he was being pressed on the sort of timidity of the reset and where was it going. And his general point is, well, I wouldn't have started from here. So I think, a bit of pressure from some people at Labour that they're not going fast or far enough, and a bit of pressure to go further. Kemi Badenoch had a couple of sentences in her conference speech. One where she said, the Conservatives, one of the Conservatives' big achievements was they took Britain out of the EU, delivering on the biggest popular vote in our history, which she put in her speech just after same-sex marriage as something the Conservatives delivered. And she did say that the state had massively expanded since Brexit. And did you notice government getting any better? But she didn't seem to take any logical consequence that maybe all those civil servants we had to add for Brexit weren't doing terribly productive things. Necessary but not very productive or state enhancing, and actually that doing business got a lot harder for a lot of people facing the other end of the new compliance costs. So I thought that was all quite interesting. I went to a Conservative European Forum meeting at the Conservative Party conference, which was not super well attended. There were a few people there, and I actually asked the panel whether they saw any prospect that their view might start to regain a bit of purchase in the Conservative Party. And Andy Street, who was on the panel, so the former mayor of the West Midlands, former Conservative mayor and former businessman, said that his hopes are pinned on the economy so underperforming that people would be forced to reappraise all options, and that would include getting back closer to Europe. But there's a lot of hand-wringing on that panel, I think it's fair to say, about the need to get our party back, the need for our party to be more rational. And of course, the only person who's offering a sort of more distinctively European prospectus is Ed Davey, who was talking about rejoining, creating customs union with the EU as then sort of setting a path towards rejoining the single market, not yet the European Union. So it'd be interesting to see where that goes. And the Lib Dems do sort of much more spontaneously say, Europe is a solution to some of our problems in a way that I think the other parties are still quite reticent to do. One of the big draws at the Conservative Party conference, I didn't go to this because it was quite a small room, was Michael Heseltine doing a huge big tirade against current policy. And there's quite an interesting piece by Stephen Bush in today's FT about, how the Conservatives managed to alienate that sort of old conservative middle ground of people. I think Stephen describes it as people who want to be successful. I think Ben Ansell's described them on his Substack as the professional middle classes who probably voted Remain, still in work, so see some of the problems or whatever. And I think there's, it's interesting that is there a sort of vacancy? Do the Lib Dems manage to expand into a vacancy there for people who might have been sort of Cameroonian conservatives or, Lidingtonian conservatives, whatever you like, of pro-European, relatively pragmatic, sort of, economically, a bit more conservative, maybe socially quite liberal. I think it's quite an interesting thing. So maybe, in that sort of intersection between Clegg Orange Book liberals and Cameroonian conservatives, is there a space there which seems a bit underrepresented in politics at the moment?
Yeah, I think it is an interesting one, the debates around Europe and where they were and weren't happening over conference. I remember, of course, in Starmer's speech, he made a couple of clear references to what he described as the previous government's mishandling of Brexit, and that felt like sort of new ground for him to move into.
Well, the manifesto talked about Boris Johnson's botched Brexit deal.
Mm.
The reset came out of that. But I think we are seeing ministers gradually being a bit more forward on Europe, following the reset. And I do think some of the public opinion polling, which we know they obsess about a bit in Number 10, is suggesting that for some people at least, there is a bit of there's a space to be more pragmatic on Europe, and there was a bit more willingness to criticize Brexit, which we certainly didn't see, Brexit per se,
Yeah.
rather than just the deal, which I think is a sort of, bit of a change since last year. I mean, the other big dividing line is on the economy, where we saw the Conservatives proffer up big but pretty ropey, when you look beneath the bonnet, spending cuts from Mel Stride. I mean, taking aim at some, not as sacred cows, at sort of very conventional targets. Let's chop 25% out of the budget for the civil service by taking it back to the numbers we saw before Brexit, which is fine, but you have to tell us how you'd still perform those Brexit functions. Taking the aid budget. Remember, David Cameron put 0.7% aid into UK law. Mel Stride is taking it down to 0.1%. We've seen 0.2% from Rishi Sunak, 0.2% from Keir Starmer. Now Mel Stride's suggesting taking the UK down to go from being a sort of development superpower into a development minnow. And I think it's really interesting. Does that alienate some of the conservative base? And then proposing to take huge big chunks out of non-pensioner welfare spending. So not aiming at our voters at all. Triple lock sort of stays, though we did have a fringe event where the shadow chief secretary, who's a guy called Richard Fuller, did muse about the possibility of looking at the Australian system, where where the pension is means tested and people are encouraged to save into their personal pension, something called super, and actually get then quite a big tax allowance against it of tax-free income, but you don't get the state pension. So, and Kemi Badenoch went and said, it was fine for people to be speculating about these things, but it's definitely not official Conservative policy. And I think it's quite interesting, when we saw the Conservatives running huge campaigns against means testing the winter fuel allowance, they were in a slightly different position on disability benefit. So very, very interesting. Mel Stride, obviously a former Work and Pension Secretary, to see whether the Conservatives come through with what do their big cuts to welfare really, really look like. Because otherwise, I think you still have to sort of say that figure looks pretty incredible. I didn't think that, apart from Kemi Badenoch's sort of stamp duty giant rabbit, there wasn't any serious discussion on the conference floor from anyone about serious tax reform.
Thanks, Jill. And we've had some questions come in, so anyone else watching, please drop them into the Q&A box. A couple of them are actually about energy and net zero. So you mentioned earlier on that the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero has been effective on delivery. What was it that you would say that they've been doing right that others maybe haven't been?
Okay, I would say they've been more effective than the others, rather than whatever. I think they actually, got what mission government looked like much more than the others. We saw very early on Chris Stark, former chief executive of the Climate Change Committee, appointed to run what they call mission control. And they brought in a mix of people, insiders and outsiders, with the aim of unblocking things that might stand in the way of getting to their decarbonisation by 2030 target. They commissioned early advice from NESO on how to get to that target. I actually think the advice they should have commissioned from the National Energy System Operator, which was created by the Conservatives, I actually think the advice they should have commissioned should have been on actually, how much will it cost to get there by 2030? And, is that value for money? Should we be doing it a different way? Would it, if we went slightly later, would we be able to do this at less cost? Because I think the cost issue has been rather swept under the carpet by Ed Miliband, but they are making progress. I mean, whether it's fast enough progress is a different issue. Things like unblocking the grid, trying to improve connections, running new auctions, bringing in things. We're hearing stories today about approving some big new solar farms, which are now nationally significant projects. So Ed Miliband can approve them rather than wait for local planning authorities to see how that turns out in practice. So I think they are actually pulling the levers that they have on this. And Ed Miliband was one of the big winners from the spending review because he managed to hold on to some of his budget for warm homes and things like that, though through these things which, don't ask me to explain, Dean, called financial transactions, which means they're slightly sort of, done through odd means. He's got GB Energy up and running. They've got some stuff with the National Wealth Fund. So I think, in terms of getting their ducks in the row, they are getting ducks in a row in a more effective way than we've seen. I mean, so their plan for energy decarb was out in December. Compare that with how long we had to wait for Wes Streeting's much delayed 10-year plan for health. And they didn't suddenly go and decide to make massive structural changes after 6 months, as Wes Streeting did on NHS England. And I think the other missions are a bit sort of, what I call mission in action. I mean, they're a bit difficult to detect really where we are on opportunities or safer streets. Growth obviously is the government's sort of big obsession, but there are some big issues on net zero, even for on energy decarb. And one of the sort of really big issues is this big battle over data centers, where they're going to go, what that does to demand, how we're going to provide the clean electricity needed to do that, things like that. And, there are quite a lot of reports of big battles inside the government between Treasury and Number 10 and DESNZ over the siting, whether to go for a big data centre in Teesside backed by Ben Houchen, the mayor, or whether to go for a big BP hydrogen plant, which is Ed Miliband's preference. So I think they've sort of got more of a grip, and they've actually set up quite good internal structures to try and take things forward. And Ed Miliband is very clear about what he wants to do, whether you agree with him or not. He's quite clear about what he wants to do.
And another question that's coming about the net zero and climate change act is coming from Jack. It's more of a question, or maybe a political question, around the Conservative shift on the issue and whether it be an effective vote winner, given there is, some would say public support for net zero, and Reform have already taken the stance early on as anti-net zero. Is there much ground to be won for the Conservatives there?
Well, I think this is one of the questions that is confronting all the parties on how they deal with reform. I mean, Mel Stride, as Nigel Farage, the one thing I didn't mention is he also wants to save some of the money the government's spending on net zero by scrapping things like the warm homes plan and things like that. So that's in his cost savings. So I'm not sure that's great for people, but anyway, we will see. And they're worried about the impacts on energy bills. I think they clearly see. I think Kemi Badenoch's probably always been a bit sceptical. Claire Coutinho in her speech noted that Kemi Badenoch was one of the people who, when Theresa May put the net zero target into law, Kemi Badenoch was a backbencher, and she was one of the few who queried that as a thing. So I think she's got sort of track record of genuine skepticism. Claire Coutinho's obviously changed quite a lot since she was Energy and Net Zero Secretary, but I think she was probably always a bit more sceptical than the government's position there. I think it's one of the really interesting questions of how do parties confront reform? Do they try and take it out as an issue by basically moving to a very similar position to reform? So the Conservative position is a bit different to reform, because Kemi Badenoch was saying, I'm a climate change skeptic. I'm not a climate change skeptic, but I am a net zero skeptic. So they just think that actually the UK shouldn't be crippling itself economically, as they would have it, by committing to net zero when we account for a very small proportion of emissions, and it's shoving up our energy costs, as they would say it. But she still accepts the climate science. I think, that puts her in a slightly different position to reform. Mm-hmm. But the interesting question is, are the policy consequences much different? And how does that play out? So I think we'll have to wait to see how this shift plays out in practice on that. So, so I think that's a sort of similar-ish debate to some of the things on immigration, where people are letting the agenda be set by reform. And then the question is, how far are we trying to just, neutralize reform by adopting more or less their position, if not quite their language? And how far are we actually saying something very different to reform?
Thank you, Jill. Before we come to the Q&A, and it's good to see more questions are coming in, and please continue to pose those through. Just looking ahead to what comes next. I know we've got a budget coming up in November. How would you expect maybe the policy agenda to evolve between now and then?
I think where the Chancellor has shifted the ground quite significantly is into the view that it's not just a question of making up lost headroom. It's actually a question of building a much more substantial fiscal buffer. And so people now are talking about very different numbers on tax, the numbers that they were really talking about before. And I think she's, we talk about pitch rolling quite a lot. And I think, she's got the heavy roller out. And that's a cricket analogy for anyone who doesn't watch cricket, and is really, really, really trying to roll the pitch for much more significant numbers than we might have expected, because I think she's probably taken on board the critique that last year, the combination of a very small buffer of headroom, a sort of historically incredibly low buffer, and her ironclad commitment to stick to her fiscal rules, it's quite difficult. And one of the things that has emerged from quite a lot of people across the think tank space, not yet ministerial space, when they talk about tax, and this was quite interesting. This was from a different event I went to with the chief economists of Labour together, the ex Bank of England economist called James Howard, was that there are actually big benefits to be had from establishing a much bigger fiscal buffer, because if you actually manage to regain market credibility, you would see interest rates come down much faster. And if you looked at what really would boost the living standards, and I think cost of living is a very big issue, particularly at Labour, it's a very, very big issue, but also perceived by the Conservatives as a big point of weakness, that that would actually really help a lot of working people if they saw lower interest rates. I mean, obviously bad news for people who are very dependent on savings incomes, but very good news if you are trying to pay a mortgage and you can refinance or whatever, if interest rates come down very significantly. So I think, she's shifted the ground yet. Do we see any, we've had some kite flying about tax reforms. I think it's really interesting whether Kemi Badenoch has now opened up a substantial debate about the future of property taxation. We saw that quite a lot of that when George Osborne, stymied the 2007 election by unleashing his inheritance tax rabbit. And I think it'd be very interesting to see whether the stamp duty rabbit is now out of its hutch, but whether Rachel Reeves does something many people think was super sensible, which is to actually come up with a comprehensive plan for property tax reform. But one of the things I did do, I didn't ask many questions, but I was in a thing, Politico, which I don't know whether you, anyway, if people signed up, you could sign up to a thing called the Politico Pub, which they
Yep.
did both the Conservative and Labour conferences, which was super good fun. And you could just drop in and get free drinks. So quite a lot of people there. Good Wi-Fi, which is also an advantage of the conference centre. But I dropped into the Politico pub in Liverpool, and Steve Reed, now the Housing, Community and Local Government Secretary, dropped by. And so I put my mitt up to ask a question. And I asked him if he'd thought about a council tax revaluation. Remember, council tax value is still the ones that the council tax was introduced in as a stopgap measure in 1991, when I was working in Downing, 92, when I was working in Downing Street, so a long time ago. And Steve Reed went, what? No. I haven't even talked to Rachel Reeves about that. It's not come up in any of our conversations. So I think you can say that's not a current issue around Whitehall, although maybe my impact will be that it comes back onto the agenda. So I think it's really interesting is whether this is provoking a sense that there is a market for a better reform than just binning stamp duty, which, as lots and lots of people have pointed out, if you just bin stamp duty, it hands a big windfall in terms of rising house prices to the people with most expensive houses. But if you combine it with some sort of property tax reform, there could be lots and lots of benefits. And I think it's really interesting whether Rachel Reeves responds at all to the urgings of IFG, Institute for Fiscal Studies, Resolution, lots of other people, that if she's going to have to do significant tax raising, why doesn't she actually use the opportunity, if you like, the burning platform of that, to also dramatically improve the tax system? But that certainly didn't particularly feature in anything she said at the party conference.
Fab. And maybe looking slightly beyond the budget, we're probably expecting a King's speech in the new year. Was there any signals from any of the parties or from the government in particular, what we could be likely to see on the agenda in the new year from a King's speech?
Really, actually, and I think that's one of the really interesting things about where they're going. I mean, we've seen various areas, like the government's proposing to amend its own planning bill to give themselves extra powers and things like that. And we may have to wait until next May or so for a King's speech. But you really got the sort of sense that the sort of heavy legislative lifting was being done in this session.
Yeah.
And then you get Keir Starmer saying it's all about delivery going forward. We've got to really focus on actually making things happen. Because the key thing for Labour is, will they, by the next election, be able to point to real progress? And that's the real sort of killer. I mean, they're all focusing on where they are now, but as people say, 3.5 years or so is quite a long time in politics. They don't have to call an election before May 2029. So, if they're behind in the polls, we'd expect to see that. But what you really want to do in government is capitalise on your first, honeymoon. They managed to cut their honeymoon quite dramatically short by a series of mismanagements, but whatever. But you really want to lay the foundations and do the difficult stuff. So you then are hoping you're reaping the benefits going forward. But I didn't get the sense, but I should have asked colleagues of this, that there was a massive legislative agenda waiting to wash over us in the next session. They'll have to do, if the EU reset happens, they will have to do some quite interesting legislation to bring the UK back into line with the EU acquis and actually tell us how decision shaping is going to work and what mechanisms they're going to use to recreate the sort of dynamic alignment that we used to see when we were EU members. That'll be a battleground for aficionados of Brexit debates. So, but that might be a bit niche, but I didn't get the sense there was a massive legislative agenda waiting to happen. There may be some things that fall at this session that have to be carried over because they get too bogged down in the Lords, like things like, I haven't followed where they are on House of Lords reform and stuff like that. So it might be quite interesting to see where they are. But I don't get the sense that there are huge numbers of draft bills knocking around. As I said, there weren't dramatic new policy announcements from any of those. I mean, the Prime Minister is clearly incredibly preoccupied with foreign affairs and other things the government wants to do, like, boost defence spending, rush through planning decisions, try to get more houses built, deliver its energy policy, don't actually require legislation. The legislative building blocks are there.
Thank you, Jill. I'm going to come over to the Q&A now because we've got some questions coming in, and it would be good to see some more pop in. So people, if you're watching and got any questions, please pop them, as I said, in that Q&A box. I'm not sure how across you were on public transport. I have had a question over the conferences. Were there any key themes or talking points around public transport?
Not so I'm going to feel very guilty here. I think transport is very interesting, but no, there wasn't much, I don't think. I didn't see very much. There weren't sort of loads of exciting new announcements from anyone on anything. We didn't get anything like the Conservatives' dramatic cancellation of HS2. So I think, plugging on, I think, is probably where we are. We also didn't get, big announcements on roads or anything. So I think transport's really interesting because transport, whether it's roads, which, cars, which matter to most people because that's their prime mode of transport, or public transport, which are much more obsessed with in London because we tend to use it much more, just never features as a really massive issue in these sort of political debates. And I always find that a bit weird because it really is a sort of thing that affects people absolutely every day. But I didn't notice lots and lots of events about transport policy, where it was going. And I have to say, I don't remember any of the very significant speeches. There wasn't lots of sessions on buses and things like that. So really sorry, but I didn't notice very much on that at all. But that may just be the particular bubble I was wandering around in. One of the things that is really interesting in terms of the tax reform agenda is how nobody's addressing the future of fuel duty and whether to move to road pricing. Quite a few conservative think tanks have said this is the way to go, but everybody's just sticking their head in the sand about the potential revenue consequences of the move to EVs.
One area where transport sometimes does get wrapped up in is in local government and or devolved matters to some of these mayoral areas. And we've had a couple of questions come in about local government. One is around the reform proposals for local authorities and local government, and what impact do you think councillors can have on those decision makers within the party? And if some of those councillors' voices are ignored, are we thinking there might be some more defections to other parties within those local authorities?
So it's very interesting, to which the honest answer is, I don't know. I mean, what is interesting is that clearly local councillors are a lot of the people who come to party conferences. They're the most active party members. And it is an opportunity for them to, get together with MPs, ministers and things like that. So I do think this is actually one of the critical times for influencing. I didn't go. IFG, and these will be on our podcast, did do some events on local government reform. It was the topic that we addressed at the Reform Council. And I think one of the interesting things about reform is how different reform councils are grappling with the reality of being in government. So we did an event with the leader of Kent. And one of the things we saw very early on from the leader of Kent was a thing saying actually the government's decision to restrict the health and the social care visa was going to be massively inconvenient in Kent for provision of social care, which wasn't, if you like, quite from the reform playbook. And now Kent is one of a number of reform councils which have concluded that actually the Conservative councils that they replaced were not spendthrift, wasting loads of money on equality, diversity and inclusion initiatives. There weren't really easy savings to be made, and they were going to have to put up council tax by the maximum that they could. So I think that was a sort of, that's going to be a really interesting emergence or set of themes at reform, because Farage still talks about our wonderful Doge unit, but the people who should be the beneficiaries of the Doge unit are, we would say, unsurprisingly, finding that there aren't the easy pickings there, and actually, yeah, local councils, certainly upper tier councils, are now absolutely consumed by their statutory duties around social, adult and children's social care, which eats the lion's share of their budgets, and they're facing some quite difficult decisions. I think it'll be quite interesting to see how things play out when we get far more council elections next year as well. Normally, local government reform is quite difficult in the UK, simply because incumbent councillors don't like the prospect of losing their jobs. It's why we have this sort of very awkward mayoral model outside London with a mayor and combined authorities, because nobody basically loses their job, and that's the route to mayors, is to impose another layer, rather than in London where there was a vacuum and you could have the mayor and the Greater London Assembly and things like that. So interesting to see, whether they act as veto players. And I think there'll be very interesting battles to come on planning, and see where the government sort of starts to take on things. But those will probably be Labour ministers versus predominantly non-Labour councillors. But the interesting feedback there will come not from Labour councillors, but from Labour MPs. And one of the really interesting things about Keir Starmer having won so big last year is that so many Labour MPs represent non-typical Labour constituencies. There's now a thing called the Labour Rural Research Group, which is Labour MPs who represent rural constituencies with lots of farmers and things like that, who aren't sort of conventional Labour. So I think that's an interesting future battleground. One of the things that is always interesting at party conference, I mean, clearly the Lib Dems and the Greens, and I'm sure Reform, are all limbering up for very big gains at the next council elections, because they really think this is where they are going to take on and drive Labour and the Conservatives out of a lot of their former strongholds. So I think it'd be very, very interesting to see next year's party conferences, if those people have stayed, and and that risk may provoke more defections, and we may see people who want to stay councillors, we may see more Conservative to Reform defections, we may see more Conservative to, or indeed maybe in one or two places Lib Dems, but probably more to Reform, and we may see more Labour to Green defections, if people think they want to stay councillors and they think that's where there's a significant threat. So I think it'll be very interesting to see. But these are, there were quite a lot of training sessions at the party conferences on how to campaign, how to win. And one of the strategies that I think people like the Greens are picking up from the Lib Dems is that a very strong presence in local government is a very important foundation, and I think Reform will do this as well, is a very important foundation for your next push into winning Westminster seats.
Yeah, it's something that I've got a particular vested interest in, I suppose, because I live down in Brighton, and we're about to become a new mayoral seat between East Sussex, West Sussex, and Brighton, and there's a lot of local government reorganisation going on within those unitary authority and county council areas. So it's it's one that's a hot topic, certainly for me to be focusing on at the moment.
Yeah, no, and the leader of Brighton, Bella Sankey, was doing, the Labour leader of Brighton, she appeared on quite a few IFG fringe events because she was very willing to say yes to invitations, and people, I think that she may be laying the groundwork for a mayoral bid when that mayoralty comes up. So
yeah, that would make sense. There's a couple more questions. I know we've only got 5 minutes left, so I'll quickly go through them. So this one's coming from Megan Edwards, and it's about the government's focus on technology and innovation as a way of meeting its wider missions and objectives. And there's been a bit of skepticism about how much emphasis the government is placing on the potential of things like genomics and AI and big data, specifically in the NHS. Would you say that there's maybe too much enthusiasm for those tech solutions,
I did.
or can it deliver the tangible change that the government wants to see?
That's a bit out of my thing. I think there are, I mean, we see Wes Street and drip feeding announcements about where AI is helping improve things in the NHS. And I think there is some scope, whether it's a super dramatic scope. We spent a lot of the last year trying to track down, it's a very similar number to Mel Stride's 47 billion. The government claimed that there was 45 billion of savings to be made from deploying AI in better government systems, and making it easier for the public. But that number seems to trace back to a sort of unfootnoted report, but seems to be some Tony Blair Institute. Tony Blair Institute is quite big at the party conferences. They're sort of quite a big presence. Obviously, they're pushing this agenda very, very hard. One of the things that really was interesting, which is I will shoehorn it in, was the discussion on ID cards, which had been
Yeah.
unleashed. And by the time you got to the Labour Party conference, there were already protests. So one of the things that was different, as the Conservatives said, you could tell our conference, we're out of power because even the protesters didn't bother to turn up for the Conservative Party conference. But as you went into the conference hall at Labour, you would run the gamut of a whole range of people, whether it's on abortion, some guy saying pedestrianise the M6, big Brexit one, and Labour Brexit's no better than Tory Brexit. But there were quite a lot of people who'd already mobilised against digital ID cards, which I think was quite impressive mobilisation. And I think the government has got itself into quite a sort of mess here with a sort of premature launch for not a very obvious reason. Quite a lot of confusion about, is this a law enforcement thing? Is this all about migration? Better labour market enforcement? Liz Kendall was in Parliament yesterday. But the interesting thing was Keir Starmer didn't mention it in his speech. And there wasn't much talk about it. There were no events about it because it was sort of, such a blindsiding rabbit. I suppose if you were asking, actually go roll back to your legislative programme, if the government decides to proceed, I think that's quite a big if, because they've said they'll go and consult. If the government decides to proceed, I think that will be one of the big battleground pieces of legislation in the next session. So I think that will be quite interesting to see. So, and I wrote an explainer for IFG on digital ID cards, which had, just went bonkers on the number of downloads, I think. And suddenly I was asked to do all these media appearances about it. And I said, honestly, I just cobbled together something in an afternoon. I really don't know anything very much about them. But it is quite interesting because one of the risks that, we've seen lots of attempts before to do this. And one of the things is the purpose always seems to morph from what the government first thinks of to lots of other things. And it's never clear whether these are mandatory or just potential uses. Wouldn't it be nice if I don't have to find my council tax bill in a drawer every time I want to open a bank account and things like that? So I think it's really interesting. I think the government hasn't done, I think that's a really sort of poor piece of policy making on this by the government. And it might have been better if they'd gone at it. But I do think there is AI potential. But I think AI needs to be more reliable. It needs to stop hallucinating and inventing things when it doesn't know the answer. So I think you'd at the moment be quite worried about over-reliance on AI, but I'm sure we'll sort of start to harness it and see things come through as, marginal system improvements.
Thank you, Jill. And any questions we haven't got to, we can maybe try and answer afterwards. But before we go, I'd like to ask you on reflection, after the conferences, if you're looking ahead to the next 12 months, if you could make one political or policy sort of prediction, what would you go for?
I'm not going to do a political policy prediction because I can't do that. But I think the really interesting question, Mark, going into this party conference, these weren't party conferences about big policy battlegrounds. They were about the leadership staying power of the leaders of the two main parties. So I think we have, two leaders who clearly are going nowhere, which is Farage and Polanski, and riding very high and very, very similar, I think, in many ways, very similar. They'll both hate me for saying that, but they are super similar. Both very good speakers, both, you know, adoring, faithful, quite good rabble rousers, and etc. Ed Davey, I think there's an interesting question about, you know, when does lack of cut through land on Ed Davey's door? And do people think there's somebody else? But yeah, it's not immediately clear that the other sort of, you know, that there's a Lib Dem leader in waiting. That was quite interesting that we did an event at the Lib Dem conference, Nick Clegg, which got a lot of people there. And he did the world's biggest ever book signing where at a party conference where he was signing loads of book and everybody wanted a selfie with Nick Clegg. So, you know, if they can find someone charismatic, then maybe Lib Ed Davey. But both Starmer and Badenoch bought themselves more time by better than expected speeches, even, you know, or whatever. But I think the two big events in the coming year, which will determine probably the course of politics over the next parliament, are the budget. What does Rachel Reeves do? Does she manage to present it? Does she manage to get Labour backbenchers behind it? Can the government actually deliver what it says? And I think, you know, and does she manage to start breaking out of the sort of doom loop she's got herself locked into a bit? And then the bloodbath that will be the May elections. You know, we haven't talked about the SNP, but John Swinney gave quite a confident, bouncy speech on the case for independence yesterday at the SNP conference. The prospect that Plaid will be the lead government in Wales, which is just a sort of, if you're in Wales, a non-Labour government leading in Wales is just such an earth-shattering event. You know, that will be really, really interesting. Probably be a Plaid Labour coalition of some sort, but that will be, how does Labour adapt to that? And quite who will be running local government for the rest of the, is massively interesting. You know, does Labour hemorrhage support in London to the Greens, a possible Corbyn Sultana party, to Palestinian activists, or does Palestine go off the radar as an issue if anything happens, you know, if the Gaza peace holds? And she had put big question marks about it. I think that's massively interesting. So that's where the real focal will be. And I think one of the really interesting other questions, just to end, is does the news get any better for Labour? You know, everything is sort of downside for Labour at the moment, but are there going to be any upsides? You know, or there, you know, upsides relative to an even worse base case like Trump tariffs and things like that? I think, you know, are we suddenly going to see some positive news coming for Rachel Reeves on the economy?
Thank you very much, Jill. Some very good questions to be watching out for over the next year, and some great reflections on this year as well, on this year's conferences. So thank you very much, Jill, and thank you for everyone for watching as well. And we'll speak to you soon about what's coming next in our webinar series. Thank you, and have a good rest of the day. Cheers.